Welcome to this session on ISO TC 283, Occupational Health and Safety Management. Now, because the theme of this conference is trust, we have focused our session today on trust and how occupational health and safety management and the work of this committee can work towards building trust. However, if you also have questions that we're not covering about the specific work we do, any document that we're developing or have published, please do just ask. It's your session. We want you to get what you want out of it. So please help us direct the session if it's not going in the way you would like it to. So a little bit of housekeeping. This is an interactive event. Although you can't speak to us verbally, you do have the chat function and you do have the question and answer function. So please use it as much as you like, including if you have any technical difficulties, because we do have a technical team on standby waiting to help you, and we can usually resolve any issues. We're going to answer as many live questions as we can throughout the session. Please don't wait till the end. It makes it more interesting, I think, for you if you can ask the question when it occurs to you, and we'll bring it in at the appropriate moment as much as we can. And of course, this webinar is being recorded, so it will be made available to you after the event, and you can always contact us if you've got any questions or would like anything else from us. I will introduce myself first, since I've been talking already, and then I'm going to ask Martin to introduce himself. My name is Sally Swingewood. I'm a lead standards development manager at BSI, and I'm also the committee manager for the Occupational Health and Safety Management Committee, ISO TC 283. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Sally, and hi everyone. Thanks very much for joining this session, which I hope you'll find worthwhile. As it says on the slide here, I'm the chair of ISO TC 283. I've actually been involved in OH&S Standards development for around about 25 years. Originally involved in the development of the first standards to which organisations were certified for their occupational health and safety management, including the OSAS 18001 standard that some of you will perhaps remember. I chaired the British Standards Committee and was head of delegation for the UK during the development of ISO 45001. And then upon publication of that standard, this committee, ISO TC 283, was formed, and I became the chair of the committee at that time. My background is in engineering risk management, in fact, originally in the nuclear and petrochemical and offshore oil and gas sectors. And I've spent much of my career in major hazards safety alongside a spell working more on occupational health and safety. I not too long ago completed 31 years working for the Ship Classification Society Lloyd's Register as the group's technical assurance and quality director. So that, again, a job in which management system standards and certification to those standards played a fairly important role.
Thank you, Martin. Okay, so we're going to start with a little bit of interaction. Warm you up, see if you're paying attention. I'd like you to answer in chat, please, this question. What does occupational health and safety mean to you?
So what words come to mind, colleagues, when you think of occupational health and safety? You know, what short word, or short phrase is immediately at the front of your mind? Be interesting for us to see how that relates to the sorts of topics that we're likely to cover in this session.
So thank you, Sam, for starting us up with safety and well-being. No one is made ill or is injured through the work they do. Yeah. Keeping all employees safe, having a policy, ensuring our colleagues leave in the same state they arrive in, having an environment which to work that is safe, comfortable and conducive to good culture. Oh, they're coming in the Q&A as well. Interaction with staff on issues that affect theirs and our customers' health and safety. So I would say these are spot on, Martin, in terms of the way that our committee looks at health and safety management.
Yeah, absolutely, Sally. And I'm really encouraged, and it sets a really good foundation for today's session and conversation to see an equal mention of health as well as safety. You know, historically, health and safety management systems in many organizations were frankly safety management systems with a little bit grafted on the side where legislatively necessary to deal with specific health issues. And that word well-being, which Sam mentioned right at the front, of course, is almost the, you know, the most modern includes, if you like, the most modern representation of health and safety, which is that extension onto the well-being of employees and the recognition of how conditions in the workplace have a bearing on employees' well-being, and particularly, of course, in the years since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, a really considerable recognition of and breaking down of taboos about psychological health in the workplace. And that's a really important area for our committee, having published last year ISO 45003 on psychological health and well-being in the workplace. And yeah, there were some other statements there which I thought just absolutely captured you know, the overall objective that people go home well, that work has not, that no one, Kevin's remark, I think is great, no one is made ill or injured through the work they do. So that's really encouraging. It sounds like we're all on the right page in the sense of what modern health and safety management is trying to achieve, and the recognition of the breadth of that, you know, through to from safety to health and including psychological health as well.
And we've got a really well established in the UK and in Northern and Western Europe, North America, for example, a really good health and safety history in terms of actions have been being taken for a long time. It's embedded in what we do. But how are we doing, Martin?
Before we do that, Sally, just one thing, the most recent thing I've seen in the chat, which I just wanted to pick up on, and that's a comment from Ken, that good OHS makes people happy to come to work and do a good job. And I think that points to another important thing, which we increasingly have come to realize in organizations, which is that good health and safety is an enabler of good business performance. You know, that's how organizations become resilient and sustainable, is having people who are happy to come to work and do a good job. Those are the people who get organizations through difficult times, not people who are worn down, disillusioned, and generally feeling, you know, put upon or you know, not well treated. So I think that's another important element, is it's not just about health and safety from the human perspective, although clearly that's the starting point, but actually from a business perspective, it just makes good sense financially for the sustainability and the performance of the business too. And so, yeah, it would be nice to think that important message meant that globally everybody was on the case of good health and safety. And that, you know, that sadly isn't entirely the case. And even people who are trying still, I think, find it quite a challenge. And so I think the stats on this slide tell us that there's quite a lot still to do here. You know, at the bottom of the slide, over 6,000 people dying from work-related causes every day on this planet. And you think of that in terms of the human impact of the families who are impacted for, you know, potentially years and years to come from this, you know, from an event like that. And also the occupational accidents, 340 million accidents in the workplace. It's easy to think that perhaps the challenge is with the developing economies, which is often where we've offshored some of our more hazardous operations, industrial operations. You know, we see it here in the West. We have less heavy manufacturing and high risk activities. Many of those activities are now carried out in developing countries, countries in the Far East and so on. And that ought to mean that we in the developed world have an easier time in terms of health and safety, because those activities are not carried out on our shores anymore. But actually, the statistics tell us something different, which is that in the developed economies, there has been a plateauing in recent years of what until then had been a trend of steady improvement in OHS performance. And that improvement might have been for the reasons I've just described, coupled with, the continuing efforts of organizations, of regulators, governments, everybody else trying to drive better safety performance, and better safety performance was happening. But that hasn't been the case over the last 5 to 10 years. There's a plateauing and even something of a deterioration in performance now being seen in the developed world. So for none of us is there the scope to be complacent about this.
I think it's worth adding, Martin, isn't it, that you mentioned previously how delighted you were that people were mentioning health and well-being in their comments. And these figures aren't really reflecting the impact of not managing health and well-being to the full extent. So in the UK, over half of time lost at work is health related, and most of that is mental health related. And it's worth also knowing or taking on board that when people go off with issues related to mental health, with stress, anxiety, or any of the related conditions, they are off for considerably longer than if they have become physically unwell or have injured themselves. Often people go off on very long-term sick leave. Many of them don't come back, or they come back but they're not fully recovered and still not able to do the kind of level of productivity and job that perhaps they did before. And I just want to draw your attention to this 750,000 deaths in 2016, that was, so we don't know where we're at now, but from long working hours. And this really draws that link between mental health and physical health. So we know from a psychological point of view, having too much work, working more hours than you should, not having enough access to rest time, to downtime, time with friends and families, it's not good for your psychological health, and it can lead to depression and anxiety and other conditions. But it can also lead to high blood pressure, heart attacks, things that are killing people. And it can lead to suicide. So in the construction industry, for example, men in construction are 3 times more likely to commit suicide because of work than in any other profession. And that is a higher number than it's a third again from women in the industry, and double the general, at least, for everything, all the other causes. So, there's lots of different parts on this. So what effective health and safety management does in an organisation is build trust, to the point that many of you have made. We want to be able to trust that our workplace will look after us, so that all of us are confident that we're going to go home in a decent state after our hours of working, whether it's day or night, however our work is organised. We want to know that we can trust our employers to look after us and not put our health or our physical safety at risk. So, Martin, do you want to tell our attendees a little bit about our committee?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Sally. So, colleagues, let me try and introduce you to ISO Technical Committee 283. As I mentioned earlier, the committee was formed in 2018 following the publication of ISO 45001. And in fact, in the top right-hand corner of the screen, you can see a photo from the last face-to-face meeting that the committee has held, and that was pre-pandemic, taking place in Kigali, Rwanda in, correct me if I'm wrong, Sally, the autumn of 2019, I believe. So the purpose of our committee is to drive improvement in OHS performance across the world by helping organisations, by providing the guidance that they need to make their occupational health and safety management systems effective, and to provide guidance on topics related to OHS where that seems appropriate. And a good example, since we've just mentioned the pandemic, was the development of safe working guidelines specific to the COVID-19 pandemic in the early months of the global spread, and we'll, I think, touch on that later in the session, Sally. So our aim is to help organisations perform, and I think it's important we emphasise that as a committee, that's where our focus lies. Not, as I often say, on being a document factory that simply churns out documents and has a warm feeling because it's published 3 more documents. Our big concern is about impact of those documents and effectiveness of those documents, whether we're meeting user need and whether our documents are visible to those whom they're intended to benefit. We're trying to assist organisations of all types across all sectors, organisations of all sizes, and organisations operating in all geographies. And that brings its own challenges. We might touch on that later. And of course, the motivation, as we've said in our earlier discussion, is the impact on the lives of workers and their families, the impact on the productivity and financial performance of organisations and the wider economy. There is a huge prize globally if we can succeed in helping organisations to deliver better OHS performance.
Apologies, I have a cat who's decided to interact with our session today. So noise is off, I apologise for, but there's not much I can do about it. Okay, so on this slide, Martin's already mentioned that ISO TC 283 was formed in 2018 on the publication of our management system standard, ISO 45001, and since then we have been developing documents to support that. And to do outreach with the stakeholders Martin was mentioning, to try and work out if the standard that we published is doing what we need it to do and the kind of help that people might need. One of the things you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen is that this committee was awarded the prestigious ISO Lawrence D. Eicher Award this year. And that was one of the reasons we wanted to speak to you today, to share a little bit about why we were given this award and what ISO would like us to share with all standards makers in terms of good practice, innovations that we're making. And Martin's touched on a few of them. Martin, do you want to say a little bit more on this?
Oh, you've caught me unawares, Sally, sorry. Yes, I mean, we were very delighted to win this award and for the recognition for a relatively young committee of the efforts that we've made in a number of areas. And that includes our efforts to increase the participation, for example, of developing countries into our work that we've done around inclusivity within standards, and I think that's very relevant to today's discussion because of the direct connection there to the whole topic of trust, and to things such as the rapid development of ISO PAS 45005 in the early months of the COVID pandemic, where we were able to bring a document to fruition in what in ISO terms is a fairly remarkable 3-month period from the first meeting to publication. And we've learnt a lot about operating in an all virtual world, keeping our work programs on track when we know that that has proved a considerable challenge for many committees. And we've learnt, I think, a lot about how to build consensus more effectively than probably we were doing when we were meeting in the old-fashioned face-to-face way. So there are a number of things that we've done which have caught the attention of the judges for the Lawrence D. Iker Award. And Sally, you might want to add to that list.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right. We are going to touch on some more of that later on, so I don't think we need to go into detail. But that is very much part of our session today. These things that ISO have commended us on in that judging panel are very much part of this building trust that we are focusing on today. But before we go there, let's just have a look at the documents that we have published to date. As Martin says, we're not a document factory. We look at some committees, and because of the nature of the work they're in, they do publish lots and lots of documents, partly because there's new innovation and technology and things change very quickly. Now, in occupational health and safety management, fundamentally, not much is changing, because fundamentally, we just want to stop people being hurt. We want people to feel safe and happy and know that they'll be looked after at work. But there are elements to that occupational health and safety management which people aren't so familiar with, may need a little more help with, and that's where our focus is. So Martin has mentioned that we published ISO PAS 45005 on safe working during the COVID-19 pandemic. That document is still available free to read on the ISO COVID pages, with a lot of good advice that can be applied to other respiratory contagious diseases that can perhaps help you whilst we work on the more generic guidance. So do take a look. ISO 45003 on psychological health and safety is also available to be read for free on the ISO COVID pages, because we are absolutely aware that, as our health and safety executive expert always puts it, this is the other pandemic, and this pandemic is not going to be over as quickly as the COVID pandemic, which isn't over either. So that's a bit of a sobering thought. So go and have a look at these documents. There's no barriers to you just getting some information out of them, getting some ideas. They're written for everybody. They are not written for occupational health and safety experts. They're not written for psychologists or people who specialise in infectious diseases. They are written for people like you. In terms of implementing our management system, we have the handbook, the Occupational Health and Safety Management Systems Practical Guide for small organisations. Again, it's very accessible. It's written to be used by anybody. So do take time to have a look at those if you feel you can impact the health and safety in your organisation, whether you are responsible for it or not, because really occupational health and safety is all of our business.
And just before we move off that slide, Sally, maybe we should just talk to the participation down in the bottom left there. We're using, I think, ISO terminology when we talk about participating members and observer members, but it's perhaps worth just decoding that for colleagues. These are countries participating through national standards bodies. So we have 99 countries who have some direct involvement in the work of this committee, the majority as participants and some others as observers. It's quite interesting. We don't have the map, I think, as part of this slide deck, but to look at that geographic spread, it certainly drives us as a committee to identify areas for attention in terms of trying to grow levels of participation. Probably the areas of greatest concern to us at the moment in terms of participation levels are Africa and Latin America. But that provides a very powerful network to have mirror committees in almost 100 countries contributing to our work, because they represent a very diverse group of stakeholders who are contributing to the work of the committee. In some cases, those mirror committees are not much more than 1 or 2 people. But on the other hand, conversely, in the case of the US, the mirror committee numbers over 100 people representing a wide range of industrial sectors and other stakeholder groups. And then we have external liaisons, as they're described, and those are typically international organisations which interact directly with the committee and contribute specifically to our work. So IOSH, the Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, based here in the UK, is one of those international liaisons. The ITUC, Sally, I think, is one of them. So the International Trade Union Congress. I think the ETUC, the European equivalent, is another of them. We have the employers organisation, the is that Institute of Employers, the IOE. So we're constantly looking for opportunities to build that network, because it makes a huge difference to the quality of documents that we're able to draft if we have input from such a wide variety of stakeholders.
And this is a call to you guys. In a way, if you're aware of stakeholder groups that you think we might be missing, whether it's nationally or internationally in the occupational health and safety arena, do get in touch with us. One of our real tenets is, we want everybody around the table, including the people who think we shouldn't be writing standards on this, because the only way we can improve things overall for workers everywhere in any kind of organisation is hearing from everybody, talking with them and working with them. So, this is a really important part of our work, our liaison and our ongoing engagement with other bodies outside the standards process. So, Martin, we're also working on some documents, aren't we? Do you want to pick up on any of these?
Yes, certainly, Sally. I'll perhaps explain what each of them is. Those of you, I mentioned the previous standard, OSAS 18001, earlier in this session, colleagues, saying some of you might remember that document, and those of you who do remember it will know that it came with an accompanying document, OSAS 18002, which was the implementation guide. So recommendations and suggestions as to how to implement the requirements in the 01 document. Essentially, the document we're due to publish early next year, ISO 45002, is the equivalent kind of document to support implementation of our baseline standard requirement specification, ISO 45001. The other documents shown here on the screen are guidelines, just providing specific guidance in areas of occupational health and safety which merit the provision of guidance, and where advice is needed, I think, by organisations. I think it's important to say that these two documents, ISO 45004 and 45006, both due for publication in 2024, they are capable of being used as standalone documents, but also they would serve as guidance to help meet the requirements on the relevant topics within ISO 45001. So they can be used either way around, and that's been our preference with guidance documents. Some of the ones that we mentioned on the previous slide, the ones we've already published, can be used standalone or can be used in conjunction with our requirement specification 45001. So the two documents currently in development, in terms of likely order of publication, 45006 is further advanced. This builds on the work we did in ISO PAS 45005, where we provided guidance specific to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this document generalizes that by providing guidance on prevention and management of infectious diseases in the workplace. And I think we've all learned quite a lot through the COVID pandemic, says he, snuffling away through a respiratory infection, as you can probably detect, colleagues, that actually many of the provisions that we took in the early months of the pandemic, in terms of the hygiene measures in particular, that we implemented both personal hygiene, the hand washing, but also the sanitizing of lift buttons and door handles and things like that. A number of those relatively straightforward provisions had quite a significant effect on the transmission, not just of COVID-19, but of other diseases. And it's made it very clear to us, I think, that seasonal influenza, for example, is not something that we have to just accept as being at the level it always naturally was or is. It is something which organizations and individuals in organizations can make a difference in terms of the extent of the spread. And we know organizations, particularly in some sectors, transportation being one, can be quite significantly impacted by seasonal influenza, for example, to the point where there is business disruption. So, there is an incentive in all respects to think about managing infectious diseases better. And I guess the other area where we need to think perhaps more about infectious diseases and think differently than perhaps we did in the past is climate change, because we are seeing changes in the spread of and the geographic profile of infectious diseases. So diseases we might never have expected to experience before will now become a possibility in the workplace. We have colleagues on the committee who've talked about the spread of tick-borne diseases edging ever further north, for example, in the US. Because of climate change. And so it was completely off the radar of many companies, but now it starts to become an issue. And our other guidance document here is on performance evaluation in OH&S. Quite, as I have learned through participation in this work, quite a tricky topic for many organizations. And of course, the spotlight is on organizations' OH&S performance more these days, perhaps, than it was in the past, with a greater focus on resilience and sustainability, and in particular, ESG, the environmental, social, and governance agenda. OH&S is a significant component in all of those things. And there's an increased interest in organizational reporting around those topics, and that means reporting including around OH&S. And I think many of you will be aware of some of the pitfalls around the development of balanced scorecards for occupational health and safety, and the dangers that the boardroom is basking in the glory of lots of green leading indicators for OH&S, when actually they're not really leading indicators of future OH&S performance. They're just measures of actions that have been taken, which may actually not, in reality, produce better performance. So there's quite a challenge, I think, for organizations, and the spotlight will be on them increasingly about how they measure and report performance. So I think our guidance will be very timely, but it's not proving easy to develop, and it's proving to be a very interesting project in which to be involved. And then looking further ahead, I've mentioned climate change already. We've been somewhat concerned, I think, to learn through discussion with stakeholders, including the international certification bodies, that while quite a lot of organizations appear to be actively exploring and addressing the challenges of climate change in their quality management systems, a surprisingly smaller number of organizations are doing the same in terms of their occupational health and safety management systems. And yet we are already seeing across the globe the impact on occupational health and safety of a changing climate. And we are seeing those increased risks. And so it seems perverse that organizations are not giving this due attention. So we're currently balloting the formation of a new task group within our committee with a view to producing guidance on managing the risks related OHS risks related to climate change.
Before you go on, Martin, I'd be really interested to hear from our audience. Are you aware in your own organisations, is this something that your organisation is looking at already, the health and safety risks from climate change? We in the last year, 2 years, however many years, we're seeing more and more extreme weather events. We're seeing heat waves this year across Europe, in the UK, for example, wildfires, much greater levels of wildfires than we are used to. We've seen flooding and really strong storms at a rate and an intensity that used to be very rare, and now is becoming more and more frequent. And this is affecting us when we're doing our day-to-day jobs. It's affecting people who have to go and clean up the damage caused by these events. There's lots of implications here. So just in the chat, are you aware of your own organisation already looking at this? Or have you had any experiences where you felt there should have been something in place to manage it? For example, how did you get on during the heat wave on that record-breaking day or so? Did it affect your work? Or did you see it as a one-off? Is that how you continue to see it, and it was just something to be endured for the day? I'd be really interested to hear any views if you're willing to share them, which I know is putting you on the spot. So perhaps while you're thinking about that, we'll have a look at this guidance for non-traditional.
Yes, Sally, do you want to perhaps talk to that one for a second, if you would, please?
Oh, well, just before we go there, Charlie has put in the chat,
yeah.
The main thing I observe for the company I work for is an increasing number of tactical measures, such as money to cover home office adaptations in heat, that might have been rare before, but are now pretty regular. John is saying, in the heat wave, I think you're referring to, John, we opened the business up earlier and most staff started early, and we had a few implications from this. So even those little examples shows this is beginning to impact us, and it might not yet be built into a health and safety management system, but the implications are being felt. Even without prior warning and practice on that question, we've had two very fast examples. And we know that there are more extreme examples as well, where people have had to do something. They may have not yet built it into their regular risk analysis, risk assessment, hazard identification, but they are having to react. So the document that we're looking at is intended to help be more proactive, to plan, to be aware of what might happen so that you put things in place. So Kevin is saying controlling the conditions in factories has always been difficult, especially with older businesses, buildings, and recent changes in climate has made it more difficult. Sarah is saying a lot of consideration was given to temperature reactive chemicals in storage. So yeah, these are different aspects, aren't they, Martin?
They are, and that just prompted me to think that I think we also heard reports at the time, didn't we, of certainly in London, of NHS facilities, hospitals suffering IT problems due to the excess heat, and again, probably older buildings, but the inability to quit the heat and causing overheating of equipment. And yet equally, and it's good that, you know, perhaps all of us on this session today, it seems like, you know, we've got representatives of organizations who certainly were trying to do their best to address that situation. But I also know of organizations myself which actually didn't really do anything to acknowledge the fact that temperatures within their facilities were soaring, and simply expected employees to put up with it. And I think, you know, employees' tolerance of that approach as these events become more frequent and potentially more severe is going to be quite limited, to be honest. And again, you know, we remind ourselves that OHS is is one of those areas of trust between an organisation and its employees, which can have quite a significant impact on staff retention and hence, all the costs associated with replacing people who decide to move elsewhere.
And of course, you're also risking people being injured or becoming unwell if no measures are put in place. So you're short-staffed at the very least, if nothing is being done. And this comes to our other potential new work item. I mean, Martin's just talked about the trust between employers and employees, but we're also very conscious of the fact that our working contracts, shall I say, employment conditions are changing. There's a lot of people now who aren't employed. For example, they sign up to do work on behalf of an organisation which does not employ them. If you think about all the delivery companies, all the food delivery companies, taxi firms, many of those are platform organisations where, and we've heard about it in the courts, and we know there's a lot of discussion about this, but that's lots and lots of people who aren't employed and aren't currently being given the protections that an employee has in law at the very least. And certainly these people are working in environments that the organisation does not have much control over. So it's quite difficult for the organisations themselves at the moment to understand how they can best look after these people. But that's not the only area of work we need to think about. We need to think about people on 0 hours contracts, people who don't know if they're going to get any work from day to day, people working in the gig economy where it's all very fluid and you just don't have the same controls and systems in place to look after those workers as you do, for example, a staff that turns up in a building every day to do their job and you can look at them. Martin, is there anything you want to add while I read what Susie has written?
Yes, Susie's given us some really good examples of all the range of things that organisations might well need to think about in terms of just noticing adequate ventilation, but particularly the handling aids, things like that. So yeah, very helpful. Thank you. So yes, a growing sector of the economy, I guess, is the key message, isn't it? These non-traditional organisations, and not really well covered either at the moment from a legislative perspective or indeed from a standards perspective. So we're exploring that partly in response to the degree of interest from those sectors themselves as to whether working with us to produce a standard or guidance might be a good way forward. And we've seen some indications that from a government perspective, that might be a welcome thing, that they would welcome that happening too. So we see this as quite an important future development to make sure that our standards are indeed covering everybody, all workers, everybody who's carrying out work irrespective of the employment model.
We've got a great question from Charlie in the chat here. I recently spoke to a UK company with some staff in Ukraine. They obviously tried to do as much as they could to keep their workers safe. But at what point is it beyond a company's ability or responsibility where an emergency or an event is so extreme? Do you want to talk about that from the traditional physical health and safety point of view, Martin?
Yes, I mean it's an interesting and not an easy question in some respects, but a great question for us to try and spend some time talking about, Charlie. So thank you. Clearly, there are limitations to what an organisation can do. I think the starting point in my mind is always to think about both how should an organisation respond in the moment, but also are there any lessons to learn in terms of how did this situation arise in terms of lessons for the future. And that may be a case of organizations learning from other organizations' experience, not necessarily their own. So, the question of, is to what extent can an organization anticipate where situations, is the geography in which it's working likely to be subject to disruption, is obviously one of the starting points. I would assume that, perhaps for the company you're describing, they may well have felt that there were some indications, but perhaps relatively limited indications that the situation in Ukraine was deteriorating. That certainly it appears that quite a number of governments, certainly European governments, were taken unawares by that development. And I guess if that's the case, you have to accept also that organizations are not going to be any better informed than the governments whose job it is, for want of a better way of putting it, to understand and manage those inter-country relationships. I think organizations who routinely work in very challenging parts of the world do sometimes put in place arrangements with specialist organizations who have the skill to extract employees from dangerous environments. Those are very often organizations run by ex-military people who know how to do these things, and that's certainly the oil and gas industry makes use of those kind of arrangements on occasion for some of the more dangerous geographies in which it's operating. But for a normal commercial organization, of course, that wouldn't perhaps be something that's normally on the radar at all. Sally, do you want to have you any particular insights or thoughts on angles to Charlie's question?
Yes, I will say something there, but I think Stan's made a really good point in the chat, that as a UK company with staff in Ukraine, the view is that their responsibility doesn't end because the circumstances have changed. And it's a case of doing what might be considered as reasonably practicable. And that's, a really good way at looking at it. What is in your control? What can you do? You can't anticipate everything, but if you know that you're now in a situation where there are risks to life that are totally beyond your control, you can still do smaller things that can put in controls where you can. And I just wanted to bring up the psychological health and safety aspects. And this relates to ordinary people doing ordinary jobs in Ukraine who have found themselves living and working in a war zone. They may previously have worked in, a shoe shop, not somewhere with lots and lots of hazards. The shoe shop may not be open now because the building may have disappeared because of the bombardments. However, these people are still trying to make a living. But then we've also got the emergency workers. We've also got soldiers on the ground, we've got medical workers on the ground, we've got emergency fire crews, that kind of thing on the ground. So there's lots of different aspects there on your health and safety radar, depending on the kind of people you employ to do the kind of activities they do. But no matter what kind of activity they do, this kind of situation is going to have a big impact on psychological health and safety, particularly if they don't feel the employer is thinking about it and doing something about it. And there are some fairly straightforward things you can do if you're not based in the Ukraine all the time. Just things like allowing people enough time off. They may have just had to do a whole series of very, very long days because you're in the middle of a crisis, but allowing people then to take sufficient time off to rest, to recover, setting up systems so that they can talk to family and friends, even if they can't get to them. That will help with their anxiety, and sharing all the information that you have got. In a situation like Ukraine, you're not going to have all the answers all the time. You're not going to have all the information all the time. But if the leadership is being open and honest and sharing information at the earliest time possible and talking with the workers about what are the things you're really worried about, what do you think we can do, that proper consultation and participation of resolving issues and putting some safety, some protective, some measures in place that might help, that's really going to help in terms of how well you get through a crisis like that. Don't assume, particularly if you're a UK company with staff in the Ukraine, and I'm not picking on your organisation, Stan, you're clearly taking a very proactive and ethically good stance on this. But if a leadership team in the UK decided, without consulting with the people on the ground, where the problems were and what they could do, that's never going to be as effective as actually talking to the people who are facing dangers. So that participation, consultation in decision making is really important and has quite a profound effect on how well you can look after your workers. Charlie has come back with another comment. With a more global workforce and remote working, they didn't have a particular presence in Ukraine, but did employ several workers from there. It's an aspect of remote work I haven't thought too much about, having to consider local conditions for staff in a far greater number and more diverse countries. Absolutely, and this is something that 45,003 certainly talks about, and something that is beginning to be considered in 45,006, isn't it, Martin?
Yes, Sally, and I was just thinking as I heard you talk, you know, how much in organizations there's the scope in these situations for encouraging and for initiatives through which other members of the global workforce, you know, can offer some kinds of assistance to those who are, you know, directly affected. So we're talking about Ukraine here, but that sense of you know, corporate solidarity, if you like, I think, and to Sally's point about people's psychological health and well-being, I think that can make a huge difference if people know that they are very much in their colleagues' minds and are being supported to the extent they can.
And this really does, I think, bring us back to our theme of the day, and trust. But who are we building trust with? So as standards makers, and you know, I'm assuming all of you on this call today, you're either standards makers or standard users. And I know most of our attendees at the conference will be people who have been involved in developing standards. So you will understand that one of the key parts to getting our standards to be used and to be effective and to do the job we hope they do is building that trust with the end users. And it's not just the person who picks them up in that organization and says, oh, we should implement this. It's the rest of the workforce. It's the customers of that organization, or the clients, consumers, the general public. We're living in a world where trust is in somewhat short supply in many respects. Everything is changing very rapidly. Society is quite divided in lots of ways. There's a lot of economic instability. So people are anxious at the moment about the level of uncertainty. And standards are a good way to help bring a little bit more certainty into people's lives. And certainly from a customer point of view, a consumer point of view, we are increasingly moving into a space where we are voting with our money, if you like. We're not engaging so much with organisations that aren't looking after their workforce, that don't treat people well, that haven't considered modern slavery in the supply chain, for example, that aren't thinking about their environmental impact. So this is a big trust piece where OH&S plays a part in building that trust. But the other thing that we would like to talk about and would like you to consider is how we need to build trust in our technical committees themselves. with our experts, with the national standards bodies, with our mirror committees, and with the stakeholders who often see our documents for the first time when they go out to public consultation stage, which is quite a long way into the process. And perhaps people then feel, oh, how much can I influence because decisions have already been made. So there's two different sides of the trust coin that we would like to explore here. Martin, do you want to talk to some of this? And I'll pick up if your voice is going, so just shout.
Okay, thank you, Sally. Yeah, just on that last point, I think, colleagues, when we talk about having the trust of standards writers, the national standards body representatives, and so on, I think it's very possible to have quite different outcomes from a piece of standards development in terms of how strongly those who have participated in the process are willing to go out and advocate for the resulting document. And I think that's a really important test of how well a committee has performed, and in many ways how well it's done its job around consensus building. I touched earlier on the fact that I think we've learned some valuable techniques and lessons about that in our switch to all virtual working. But a certain majority is needed to approve a standard for publication. And it can be tempting to say, well, if we can get to that percentage, we're home and dry. But it's a little bit like in quality management and customer satisfaction, the concept of the net promoter score. You really do want to be in a position where as many of those members who have sat in the room and contributed to the development of the document actually are positive endorsers of that document, promoters, people who spread the word, not sitting in that sort of more neutral or detractor place where their comments to people about the document are kind of a bit guarded and, well, yes, it's okay, but we didn't get into the document some things that we really thought were important. And so we've done quite a lot of work trying to improve our way of working to try and ensure that as many people who participate in the process emerge feeling supportive of what has been produced. And that can be quite tricky, given that you can begin with people with more or less diametrically opposed views on some aspects of a topic. So when we're thinking about building trust in the work of ISO TC 283, we're conscious that a starting point for us works in our favor is that we have the ability to produce documents that sit above either local or national politics. And I think the COVID pandemic has been the best example of that, with the development of ISO PAS 45005. We in this country had quite a lot of guidance provided by government, and the role of scientists and health professionals was fairly explicitly visible in the construction of that guidance. But that wasn't the case in all countries around the world. Guidance was much more limited. It was perhaps in some countries less clear whether the guidance that was being provided was scientific in nature or more politically shaped. And certainly the reactions that we got suggest that there was a real value to having a standard of providing safe working guidance, where that standard was developed purely by health professionals, scientists, OH&S specialists. It wasn't attempting to compete with or supplant national instruction or guidance, but it was a source of information that I think people felt was trustworthy and useful to them. Another area where I think for us trust is key is actually having as many, making sure that we have a wide representation in the development of our documents. I touched earlier on the fact that we study our map of participating countries quite closely with a view to identifying actions we can take to encourage those who are not yet involved in our work to become involved. We're also keen to make sure that key sectors, professional bodies are represented. And a very important area for us, of course, is the participation of developing countries. We want to be certain that our documents are adding value in those countries where there is so much potential for OHS improvement. We also try to be forward-looking. We've touched on that in some of the examples we've talked about in relation to psychological health, climate-related OHS risks. I think it's important for us as a committee to demonstrate to people that we are more than a rearview mirror on capturing into standards long established practice, but rather we are using standards to provide early guidance on emerging issues, and that because of our wide stakeholder network, we're capable of being one of the earliest reliable sources of information on some of these issues. On-time delivery used to be something I guess many standards committees more or less took for granted. I think the COVID pandemic has raised some challenges which mean that that's not quite so straightforward as it was. For us, virtual working does enable and has enabled on-time delivery. And again, I think it's part of our relationship with our stakeholders that if we tell you that we intend to publish or we plan to publish a standard in 2023 or in 2024, that's when it gets published. And we're also keen, and we increasingly try to make sure that early drafts, particularly of documents which are cutting new ground, are available and people are encouraged to use them at an early stage, even when they're not finally in final form and ultimately approved. That was certainly the case with the COVID document. There was lots of good advice in there even before it was signed off, and for those who found it useful, we were more than happy that they should use it ahead of publication, because it still had a considerable degree of consensus behind it, even though it hadn't cleared the final vote.
And it was the same, I think it's important to say, it was the same for the psychological health and safety document. We were right in the middle of the pandemic when we were writing that. So in 2020, when the lockdown sort of spread across the world, we were already quite a long way into it, but we hadn't got to draft international standard yet, or committee draft. And indeed, we took the decision, as allowed by the ISO directives, not to have a committee draft, but instead to share our working drafts with mirror committees at the earliest opportunity, very frequently. And the one thing all of our experts did agree on, even though we hadn't yet reached consensus to go forward and publish, was there's nothing in here that's wrong. It might be how we want to say it or what we want to put in, but actually all the advice in this document is useful and correct. And if people are suffering now, we should help them. And I think that really does help build that trust. Certainly, it also gave people the opportunity to say, hang on, you haven't mentioned this. And what about this situation? Which helped us build in more examples and build in more ways of addressing things, setting them out slightly differently, perhaps. And I think that is something that really went down very, very well once the mirror committees got used to the process. And it took a little bit of time and talking about it and discussion in the plenaries of the benefits, and that we weren't losing anything by doing this. We were actually gaining things. And it's the first document that I've been involved in that when we did finally go to disballot, we had 97% approval. It's really rare to get that level of approval. But this multiple drafts going out to member bodies really did help with that. So it's something worth considering. And it's certainly now the committee draft isn't a formal consultation stage the way it used to be. It's something that I hope more committees will make use of. ISO TC 283, I've already talked about it in what I was just saying there. One of our commitments in terms of building trust is this visibility, this accessibility and transparency. We spend a lot of effort in trying to make ourselves accessible to people and to do things like this so that we can hear from people who are not involved in the committee. We do public events where both physical and online, we haven't done a physical one for a while now, not since 2019, but we had a history of physical events where people who weren't committee members were able to join and engage in debates and ask experts. And we regularly do a couple of days of live webinars with panels of experts where anybody in the world, they're free to attend, can ask our panels questions, and we will commit to answering those questions and really doing everything we can to be visible and active and proactive and have a dialogue with people. Not being an inward looking organisation is really, really important in building trust, and it's something that is sometimes standards development is criticised as being inwards looking, that standards are written by people in closed rooms who know nothing and then determine that we all have to do something. It's a bit of an old-fashioned view, but it does still happen. And of course, that's the complete opposite of what the standards process is designed to do. But one of the ways to break down these myths around who writes standards and, you know, is it all bureaucracy and people telling us what to do, is to go out and talk to people and engage with other people. So, you know, the TC being represented in other organisations, events, being there as a guest and just contributing and encouraging those guests, whether they're individuals or representative bodies or charities, anything like that, to get involved in our events. Building that dialogue goes a long way to building trust. Martin, is there anything you want to add to that?
I think perhaps just the openness to participation. I just want to sort of emphasize, Sally, that we would much rather have and know that within national mirror committees and so on, small organizations, small and micro SMEs are represented. It's always a challenge for standards bodies to achieve that. We'd also like to think that young professionals are involved, because the standards that we are writing are not being written for the use of the people who write them. You know, the experts who come together and write the standard are probably the last people who actually need a copy of that document, because a lot of people contribute to standards when they're well through their careers and have accumulated a lot of experience, and they share that through the standards development process. But they're not necessarily the best place to judge the needs of those young professionals who actually are in many ways the target audience for the documents. And one of the challenges, I think, with the standards development process is that it's relatively, although it in principle extends to public consultation, it's a process which is, let's say, it's much easier to influence a standard if you're on the inside of standards development than if you're trying to do so through the public consultation process, because you have to know an awful lot about the techniques to how to make an effective comment to encourage a committee to make a change to a standard. And it's an awful lot easier, quite frankly, to sit in the room where the discussion itself is taking place to make the point that actually, I don't really understand what you're trying to say here. why is that there? What is the need to say that? And we best respond to comments through a public comment process when they are relatively simple comments, but which propose a specific change to wording. And actually, I don't think the comments I think the comments we're most vulnerable to missing are the sorts of comments that I really want to make sure we do pick up from young professionals, which is, well, that's fine, but what I really want to know is this. And we need participation of users in the writing of standards, not to have users only commenting from afar on the document through the public consultation process. And again, I think that's critical for us to the trust in the process. We need users to feel that the standards are written, by people like them. And if the key user is somebody relatively early in their career, using standards to kind of consolidate understanding of how things work in a standards framework or in OH&S management, then we really need to hear their voice directly as we shape the work we do. And so I'd really encourage anybody interested in being part of the process itself through participation in a mirror committee, for example, to do that. As we've moved to all virtual working, that's so much easier than it used to be. And I think it can be very rewarding as well, but it's certainly an opportunity to influence standards in a way that it isn't really so easy through public processes.
So let's go back for a moment to look at the other side of the coin of building trust through health and safety management. And we have touched on this already. Martin mentioned that it isn't just the human cost that we are talking about when we're talking about occupational health and safety. It's also business factors are involved. And you can see them on the screen here: productivity, management, change, engagement, staff retention, etc. And I'd just like us to explore these a little bit more, Martin. I think productivity, to a degree, we have already covered. I mean, our attendees have raised the point that if people are happy and want to come to work, they work better. They are more inclined to do a good job.
Yes, well, absolutely, Sally, and I think we've touched on so many of these points in the slide, but I'd be interested in any comments in the chat as to how our delegates to this session, how they feel on the topic of kind of where OH&S plays into these aspects of an organization. I certainly personally see it as quite significant these days in relation to staff retention. I think the pandemic has raised the issue of psychological health in a way which has certainly, for a younger generation of workers, made them much more sensitized to that question: is my employer doing what I might reasonably expect them to do? And I don't think that question was on people's agenda if you wound the clock back 10 or 15 years, even for what were then the younger generation in the workplace. I think it's a material change which has an impact on staff retention, which we're already moving into an era where younger generations typically expect a shorter term relationship with any given employer. So, I think that is one example that points to the fact that in a changing world, we have to be sensitive to the fact that OH&S has become, I think, a more important attribute in terms of the sustainability of an organization.
Yeah, I think people are beginning to realise, aren't they, Martin, that occupational health and safety isn't about checklists and trips, slips and falls in its entirety. I'm not saying they can't injure people, of course they can, but it's a much bigger thing than that. It's not a silo activity. It's not somebody coming around with a clipboard every now and again saying, have you got any problems that you'd like to report? It's a much more fundamental part of an organisation's success than that, which has tendrils in every part of what you do, right from the moment you think, oh, we need to recruit somebody. So if you aren't doing a good job, if you have a poor reputation from the people who have left your employment recently, and they're going on Glassdoor or one of the other various apps or social media or something like that, and saying, God, don't work for them, they're terrible, they don't look after people, you're going to have a real problem increasingly in recruiting good people, the people that you actually want. And, you know, people just are more likely to be loyal and stay a little bit longer with an employer that looks after workers and recognises that they have a life outside of work, that it's not just about work, and that they're whole human beings. So that's really important. But it's also important to your consumers. If you want a successful organisation, it doesn't really matter what you do, unless I guess you've got a monopoly, in which case perhaps we should be challenging that. But consumers, customers, the general public are going to increasingly choose those organisations who are behaving in a way which they feel are ethical. And we are already seeing this. So it's really important to think bigger picture to build this trust.
Yeah, maybe just to speak to the last of the 3 bullet points on the slide, Sally. I mean, I think this is a really important aspect of OHS, is that it's a topic area which, in a sense, transcends competition between organisations, or certainly can, where competitors can choose and do choose in many instances to come together to collaborate on OHS matters, and indeed to share experience and learn from each other. I have experience of that myself in the maritime sector in 2 ways. There's a group of shipping companies which share their occupational health and safety performance in order to build a much more extensively populated data model through which they can understand and see the trends in OHS performance in terms of incidents and the types of incidents that are occurring. It gives them the ability to pick up trends which perhaps an individual organisation wouldn't necessarily see for quite some time. And those organisations, for those who know the shipping industry, will know they compete pretty fiercely on pretty much any other aspect of their performance. But they recognise, and I think of the impact on employees in the sector, knowing that OHS is being treated in that way, even in that competitive environment, because there is a real recognition that all organisations will benefit and people will benefit from that collaboration sharing of data. And I've also seen it in another area of the marine sector where, again, having to operate on other people's sites. There's always that competitive concern that, well, if we are not comfortable to put our staff member there and we say something to the site owner that we don't think your site safety and OHS arrangements are good enough and we're uncomfortable, that the answer will be, we'll kick you out and find somebody who'll come in and not give us that pressure. And again, it's very positive to see organisations collaborating to say, actually, we will not allow that to happen. If you're not happy with the health and safety arrangements on that site, and you're not going to supply to that organisation anymore, then we won't take it over on that basis either. And I think those are really powerful opportunities to send important messages, in fact, to organisations who should be doing OHS better.
So if there's one key message for organisations on trust and on occupational health and safety and having decent performance, it's treat workers as people, not just as another resource. And I think many of us recognise that has changed over the decades. It's not as bad as it used to be, where people were seen as disposable, and there's always more. You can, kill them off, get a new batch. hopefully not literally, but certainly there was an attitude of that. And I think also we are seeing a change in as much as we are beginning to recognise that what happens outside of work impacts work. It impacts how well we're able to do our job. And what happens at work impacts how well we get on at home. And those organisations that really understand that and recognise that when you enter into an employment relationship with somebody, it is a relationship. You're getting the whole person. You're not just getting the person who works from 9 till 5 or on certain days of the week or does the night shift. You're getting the whole person. So if that person isn't sleeping well, that's not your fault, possibly, might be, but it probably isn't. But it is going to impact how well that person performs their job. If somebody is sick and there's pressure on them to come into work anyway, Martin being a good example today, you know, if we were pressurizing Martin to come into a job where he has to work physically, where he has to travel, etc., etc., what we may well be doing then is extending how long he's sick for, making him sicker, building his resentment, and making him more and more fatigued. And then you're likely to have mistakes made. You might have more physical accidents. So it's got a domino effect. So this learning in building trust is we're people. We're all people. And we need to look at each other as people, not in the same way that we look at how many hard hats have we got and have we got enough desks. It's not the same thing. Somebody who's treated well will give you a lot. Somebody who's treated poorly will not. The desk will always perform the same way, but you can really make a difference to how well your workers perform if you are looking after them and seeing them as human beings.
And I think for me, Sally, one of the questions that puts in my mind, you know, I think we're among like-minded colleagues in this conversation. But the question is, you know, what can we do to increase the pressure on those who simply don't see it that way? You know, I'm just momentarily thinking of the migrant workers used in the construction industry in parts of the world which rely entirely on migrant labour for the construction of glitzy sports stadia, shall we say. You might have an idea of the particular forthcoming sports event that I have in mind, but it really is concerning. I think, you know, we're having this conversation, and yet and there's a degree of consensus, I'm sure, in this virtual room about the importance of decent standards of health and safety. But the reality remains, and it's very uncomfortable, and the statistics we shared at the beginning of the presentation really do bring home the fact that there's still an awful long way to go. And in some very affluent parts of the world, there is still a need for really a sea change, I think, in attitude towards occupational health and safety. And I just don't know what can be done and by whom to increase the pressure on organizations to take these issues more seriously. And I think, you know, I think the situation with migrant workers is frankly a scandal, which, you know, deserves every bit of the attention it's currently getting, and probably rather more.
Mm. And you know, one of the things we can do through sessions like this, through conversations, you know, each of us, there's 29 people on this call at the moment, each of us knows a lot of people. Each of us has stakeholder groups that extend far and wide to other organisations. Being an advocate, being an ally to those migrant workers and other workers who are treated badly by the people who are paying them, it's not going to change the world overnight, but it will help. And so will our choices in terms of, do I want to engage with that organisation that paid no attention to the health and safety of its workers during the construction of a building or in the ongoing day-to-day activities that it undertakes, is that a choice that I ethically am happy to make? If we all think about it a little bit more, and it might be a little bit inconvenient for us sometimes, but if we think about it a little bit more, eventually we will drive change. Used to be acceptable to spend very small children into looms where they lost limbs and fingers and that kind of thing. Eventually it wasn't. So we can make a change in the world, but it does require us all to be advocates, I think. And we are workers. I think that's one of the things I would like to remind everybody. We're all workers. We could all be in that position of being treated poorly. We may be fortunate enough not to be being treated poorly right at this moment, but things can change in a heartbeat. A war can start and everything can change. So it's worth remembering that we are part of this global human network that needs to look out for each other.
Yeah.
Sorry, little hobby horse there, apologies. We are more or less out of time. So I'm actually just going to move us on. Alex is saying, do we really want to? Who's not going to watch the World Cup? Well, me for one, on this occasion for the first time ever, but is it making any difference? Probably not. But, you know, we have to take our personal views and actions, but yeah, let's think about what's meaningful and what actually does make a difference, because that's the way to drive change. Alex, I completely agree with you. We all feel a little bit powerless in this particular situation, I think, but if we extend our thinking more broadly, perhaps that can help. Any final questions, comments? Are you still there? Very quiet when nobody can talk to you. Martin, any closing remarks?
I think we're more or less out of time, aren't we, Sally? Certainly I've enjoyed the session and the feedback that's come through the chat. It's a pity we don't have the opportunity of voice feedback, but I think we've made the best of what was available in that respect. And colleagues, I hope you found the session interesting, and that we've thrown some light on kind of where trust features in our thinking in relation to OH&S, you know, at every level, from where it fits in managing OHS in organisations to the preoccupations that we have as a committee in terms of making sure that we are seen as a trusted source, and that the documents we produce can be trusted.
I just wanted to finish on a positive note from David has put a comment in the questions. He has witnessed the transformation of a large taxi business in the Middle East who have recognised that looking after their drivers is essential if they want to be successful. And it's been an amazing outcome on the welfare and conditions of work, and their business has survived far better than its competitors after the pandemic. So there you go, a business reason and saving lives. Thank you for that, David. It's nice to hear a little bit of positivity in there. Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap up. Do visit our website. I think you'll get these slides, so you'll get all the information. And thank you, Rob, for acknowledging the cat. Do get in touch with us if you've got any questions, if you want to discuss anything. We're always happy to talk to you. Have a good conference. We hope to see many of you tomorrow in person in Victoria. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.